Welcome to the Fairhaven Artists Podcast series on the South Coast Artist Index. Your host, Scott Bishop, will introduce you to the town's many historical and contemporary visual and performing artists. The Artist Index continues to bring you informative conversations about the historical artists and the contemporary makers, performers, supporters, and cultural impresarios. Fairhaven, Massachusetts is an integral part of the South Coast creative community. The Fairhaven Artists Podcast Series and the Fairhaven Performing Artists Podcast Series is sponsored in part with a grant from the Fairhaven Cultural Council, a local agency supported by the Massachusetts Cultural Council, a state agency.
Thank you for joining us again for the Artist Index. I am privileged to be here with Lee Blake from the New Bedford Historical Society. Lee, how are you doing?
I'm doing fine today.
I'm wondering if we just started at the beginning. You were born and raised in New Bedford. Can you tell us about your young years here in New Bedford?
Well, I had interesting young years here. Basically, my family has been in New Bedford for 6 generations, so we've been here a long time.
Wow, how far back does that go? I'm trying to do math.
1810, 1800. We've been here a long time. Between my Underground Railroad ancestors who came here from Virginia and my Wampanoag ancestors who were here from the beginning of time. So I've been here a long time. I went through the New Bedford Public Schools, graduated from New Bedford High School, went to college at the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth, SMU, all the different names that it was, SMTI, SM this, SM that. But I went to UMass Dartmouth when it only had 2 buildings, the Group 1 building and the Group 2 building.
That's staggering to think about, since I was just recently on the campus, how many buildings there are now.
That's right.
Are we talking like late 60s, early 70s?
No, early 70s.
Early 70s.
Yeah. And one of the interesting things was because there were only 2 buildings, it was a much more intimate campus. You knew almost all the professors, you knew all the students. So it was a different experience, and it was a good experience for me. I enjoyed going to school there, and actually, eventually working there many years later. But I was born and raised here, went to school here, and that is, in many ways, part of the reason that I do all this work with New Bedford's history. Because when I was going to school, we didn't learn anything about New Bedford's history. We didn't know anything about New Bedford's history. The only thing we ever learned about was Moby Dick. And as a young woman and a teenage woman at the time, I was like, well, this is all about guys. This is all about men. What about women? What did women do? And of course, then you get on to the only people of color in it are savages, which they call them savages. So I'm like, it's the 1960s. We're doing the civil rights movement. We're learning about Martin Luther King, and we had nothing to read. So I used to read. I'm in high school, and I'm reading all the New York newspapers so I could figure out what the hell was going on in my city, because no one talked about it here. So
why was it that no one talked about New Bedford here?
But there are lots of different reasons, but there was, there's a whole focus in the historical movement of working on public history, and that really didn't happen until the late 60s and early 70s, when there was a public history movement where people started to organize and tell the stories of local people. That really didn't happen until then. Before that, it was always the founding fathers and, the men who did big things. but never any discussion about the women who did big things or the people of color who did big things. But that really comes with the public history movement.
What did you go to UMass for?
Sociology. I wanted to be able to work on the issues in our community and other communities that were, at the time, that were oppressing people, and in many ways still are. I had a real commitment to working on voter registration, on issues of marginalization for people of color, and the whole idea that our young people were being educated, but they weren't learning anything about their local culture, their local communities. And that was a big issue. And I thought was very important for young people in developing their own self-awareness to know what other people had done in their own hometown and in their own families. So we, as I developed my own personal and professional career, I taught African American studies at New Bedford High School in the 70s. And then I moved to New York. And in New York, I moved specifically so that I could work with Black elected officials. So I moved to New York, and eventually that's what I did. I worked with people's electoral campaigns. I worked for the first African-American mayor of New York, David Dinkins. I was the director of education for the city of New York. So my career really was involved in creating opportunities for young people and people of color to learn more about their own history and about the opportunities that presented themselves.
What is the benefit for students who learn about that history? How can they apply it to their own lives?
Well, there's lots of ways they can apply it to their own lives. But I also think one big way is I do believe that people in New Bedford talk negatively about themselves all the time. You know, New Bedford, I don't know, I live in New Bedford. There's nothing that ever happened here. What's good about New Bedford? New Bedford was an amazing place. And the community members that lived in New Bedford at different points in time organized. So, you know, even if you talk about the textile mills and how people organized for a 40-hour week, 8-hour day, people need to know that those things didn't just happen, that ordinary, everyday people organized to make those things happen.
It also fights the general mythologizing of history, because you talked about how the history books that you had to look at in high school were all about great men doing great things, and often always pretty much excluding women, people of color.
That's right. And young people. But in order to develop a real positive sense of yourself, you want to feel like there are opportunities and possibilities where you live. And if it's all about, you know, somebody somewhere else doing some big things, you never feel like you might have the opportunity, the inspiration, the spark in your own soul to go out and change things.
I think a lot of times people also don't realize that a lot of times the big things are actually little things somebody did. It's not a big gesture. Sometimes it's somebody being active in their community to make a difference, and there's a ripple effect to that.
That's right. That's right. That's right. When I was in high school, and so this is 1968, young women couldn't wear slacks to school. You had to wear a dress all the time. So here we are, we live in New England. The winters are brutal. There was no busing. You had to walk to school. So you have to walk to school in your skirt. And the young women that I was with, we decided to go on strike. And we demanded to be able to wear pants. So a little thing like that, we went to the school committee and demanded the right to wear pants. So that's what I was doing in 1968, demanding to wear pants. And the school committee agreed. But that was like a major victory that we didn't have to dress up like automatons, that we could do what everyone else was doing, was wearing pants, wearing jeans.
And you could actually be comfortable instead
That's
of
right.
freezing your legs
Freezing.
off
That's right.
in the New
Freeze. Our
Bedford
legs
winter.
would be frozen by the time, depending on where we live. But I lived far from my middle school at the time. So little things like that, you have to stand up and say, I'm not going to take this. I'm going to do something about it. So that's just a funny little example of my early time as a revolutionary. And of course, I grew up to be a revolutionary on many other fronts, but that was like a little thing of how you could make something change and organize and talk with other people who felt the same way, but really didn't know what to do. So that's my little funny story.
And maybe also looking for someone who was willing to lead on something
That's right.
that might have mattered to them, but they didn't know how to address it.
Right. And or undress it.
Can you tell us more about your work in New York, and how much of that work you brought back and applied here in New Bedford when you returned?
Well, my work in New York, I worked at the City University at New York. I worked with higher education. I also worked in the mayor's office, worked with all the different school districts. New York had 32 school districts. So they had all these schools, 1 million students. So you have to work on how to organize and how to use each of them to the betterment, how to support and get federal money. So it's always interesting to me to listen to all the descriptions about immigrants coming into the country, because that was what I was dealing with in the 1990s. How do we get funding so we can make sure that education was being given to all of these immigrants who were coming in, all the different language groups, who all deserve to be served by the state? And the state would go to the federal government and ask for money because it was a federal government issue, and the federal government wouldn't give you any money. So here we have this whole chaos of trying to force people out, sending them back after they've been living in this country for years, but not thinking about creating a decent pathway for people to stay here. And, that's a whole other different issue. But my issue was working to make sure that the school districts in New York, 32 school districts, were creating a pathway for immigrant students to learn English, for their parents to be able to be involved in school committee meetings, but a way for people to feel that the schools had something to offer them. So that's kind of what I did in New York for a number of years, and did that also with women's organizations, this working to make sure that government worked better for people, and that we were able to support the needs of the different constituents in our region, in New York City. And I suppose what I did learn was that New Bedford is very welcoming, and was and still is very welcoming to new ideas, and was welcoming to new people coming from other places, bringing new ideas and organizing things. When I came back to New Bedford after living in New York for 20 years, people were very welcoming and not shut out. In New York, you would have been shut out because you weren't the right class, the right neighborhood, you didn't have the right network. And network was like the political cronies, those people weren't yours. But in New Bedford, it's not that involved. And when you come back with new ideas, people want to hear your ideas. And they look to you just like we look to the Artist Index for a new way of organizing information. And when I came back, one of the new ways was the New Bedford Historical Society. There's people like me who were in our 50s, who had gone away to school and had developed careers in other areas. When we came home to New Bedford, one of the things that we noticed was, again, our young people were not learning our history. They weren't learning the history that our parents and our grandparents had handed down to us and had talked to us about. So the New Bedford Historical Society wanted to know who knew about Lewis Temple, who knew about Paul Cuffey, who was teaching the ideas of the abolition movement, of the civil rights movement in our public schools. And essentially, nobody was. And none of the nonprofit cultural organizations or educational organizations were doing that. So the Historical Society comes back. Our members come back. We're all, again, in our 50s. We've developed our careers. And we began this whole focus on New Bedford's public history of people of color and women in New Bedford.
And you can powerfully see that just on the Historical Society's website.
Right.
You know, all those figures that, would have been forgotten are documented there.
I'm happy that you say that those things are on our website, but we went a step further and we made sure they were on the walls of the city.
Oh, yes.
So we made sure that when I look at our Black History Trail, for instance, the first piece of public art that the Historical Society did was in 1987 when we put up the Lewis Temple statue in front of the library. So that's the first piece of public art that the Historical Society did, but there were other pieces of public art that focused on Frederick Douglass, that focused on some of the World War II vets. So in doing our Black History Tour, we pulled all those things together so people could see we had this huge footprint around the city of monuments that had been done before us and monuments that are more contemporary. For our contemporary monuments, we have the Lewis Temple statue. We also have the murals, and we have the 54th mural, which is on the side of the Freestones building. We have the Jazz Wall.
Yeah.
We also have, of course, now we have a Frederick Douglass statue. We have Abolition Row Park, the Frederick Douglass statue, and we have a new historic district, the Abolition Row Historic District. But those are all, add-ons to footprints and monuments that are around the city that focused on people's Black culture and Black heritage and Cape Verdean culture and heritage. So it was very important for us as an organization to take these projects like the mural. So let's do the 54th mural. We helped design the mural. We helped raise the funding for the mural. We worked with our team members. So our team members with the National Park, the CVPA at UMass, and the Art Museum to put that together, to pull that whole thing together, because we wanted young people to know about the 54th. And the way to do that is not necessarily to write an article and put it in a book, but to do a visual.
To make people stop and look.
That's right. And they want to know, what's that? Who's that? Who's in that mural? What does that say? So we did all of that work. And at the same time, we had Mayor Kalis at the time who took over the parking lot right across the street, which was where the 54th members, in the 1850s, where they registered for the Civil War. So that became part of the 54th Regiment Park with the fountain and everything. So we were really creating a Black historic space, but with public art. So that is one of the things that we did. And the whole process to make sure that we were working with community members. We had listening sessions so that people could understand what we were doing and why we were doing it. And then we did a competition. So we actually did a national competition, and we got, at the time, I think we got 5 different versions of what they thought should be up there. And we picked Mr. Byard to do the piece. And it's painted on parachute cloth. So it's painted on parachute cloth for a couple of reasons. First of all, it was, at the time, it's a great medium to use, but we were concerned, as many people are, of if somebody tagged it or somebody cut it or somebody, did something
defaced it in some
disastrous, that it could be easily repaired. So the parachute cloth did that. You could just take the piece off and have it, since it was all stenciled and everything, it could be repaired. But it has never been tagged or anything.
Which is amazing.
Yeah, never been tagged. So that was something about it. But the Historical Society worked with the community. We raised the money for that. And all of the pieces that are our public art, we always raise the money for. We know New Bedford we're not a cash-rich city. We don't have banks and corporations everywhere that can donate money. So we have to work to do those things. So we have the 54th Regiment mural, and then we develop the narrative or the rat card or whatever. So those can be given to students, which we do. We work with teachers. We give them a pile of the cards. And when kids are sent on some of the walking tours with the national park, they get our handwritten information. But teachers also help us with those things, and making sure young people know. The jazz wall was very similar. I worked along with Neil Weiss and with his company. It was really something that both of us had been thinking about, is some kind of an exhibit or art piece that would focus on many of the musicians who had been mentors to the musicians of today. So just like, Bobby Green mentored a lot of people. We made sure that Armstead Christian was on there. People who went out of their way to work with young people to bring them into that whole jazz tradition. And Rick Brito and all these people who had passed away already. But we wanted to memorialize them in a very special way. So we did the jazz mural, and that was done by Kat Knudsen. And it's another opportunity where we did kind of a round table with people, ask them what artists we should look at, ask them, and then we would go to the artist's family and ask if we could use their images. Did they have images that they wanted to give us? So it's really became a way of connecting to people and to coming up with a great design. And people write us about that all the time, and you see it in different magazines.
It's one of those pieces that, as many great pieces as we have, it really stops people in their tracks.
And also now, we have Wayland City Sound uses it at a backdrop to do concerts on AHA Night. So it becomes a space. It becomes not just a piece of art, but a space that is grounded in art and creates music.
It's amazing because it really highlights the way that you're working with all of these organizations, all these different constituents in the communities, to find ways to bring everyone's ideas to the table. And then you have a mural like that basically as the setting for people to create new music.
Right, right. So doing those kinds of things it's very rewarding, of course, but it also goes back to when I was a young person and I wanted to see images of people of color, and I wanted to know about the history of people of color in New Bedford. So the way the Historical Society works on that, besides doing our lectures and talks and, reading Frederick Douglass, we do murals, we do statues, because it's a visual piece and a visual way of identifying local history.
What goes into each individual project? You talked about raising funds for it, but if you take something like Abolition Row Park, which is just not only an amazing park, but you have that amazing sculpture of young Frederick Douglass. Where does it start? Where does the idea get generated, and what's the process for, from that point to bringing it to fruition?
So Abolition Row Park is an interesting story. Initially, there were two buildings there. There were two buildings and a lot. The lot was owned by the city of New Bedford. The building was owned by a private owner who had turned it into a single room occupancy housing. So lots of people coming and going. Right across the street from the Nathan and Polly Johnson house, right across the street from a really important national historic site of the Underground Railroad, and also where Frederick Douglass lived, as well as many other people. There were lots of people who were self-emancipated, people who were writers, African-American poets and writers who lived in that building, who were abolitionists. So we wanted a way to protect the building, but also to kind of enlarge the campus, because you have the Johnson House. Next door is another property that the Johnson owned, and across the street you had the Friends Meeting House. So we always saw those 3 or 4 sites as something that we wanted to bring together and to do different programs at. But then there was a fire, and one of the houses burned down, and the other house was just ruined by all of the smoke and the water and everything. And there were no plans except to destroy them and leave a vacant lot. So, of course, what happens with vacant lots. People were throwing garbage in it, the furniture. One day we came out and there was a whole dining room in the middle of the lot. I'm like, oh no. And so we're dealing with a historic home, the Johnson House, open for tours, and people would Google the area and they would see this lot full of garbage across the street. I said, nobody's coming here. Nobody's going to come here. This is, essentially ruining the neighborhood. So we went around and we started talking to people about taking that lot and turning it into something positive. And, by then, the Historical Society was getting summer program money from the National Endowment for the Humanities. We were doing these wonderful programs in the summer with teachers from all over the country. And they would come and they would see this ugly law. So I said, this has to change. What can we do? So meeting with people, we decided that it could be a lot. Somebody wanted to build a social center there. We didn't want another building that we had to build, because it would have taken a long time, but also a lot of money. But we thought, well, why not a really attractive park that would tell the story of the abolition movement? So that's what we did. And we worked with the Historic Commission. We worked very hard with the city of New Bedford, with Pat Sullivan, who did the community office, who really helped us shape everything. I would run around and go to all these different organizations, statewide, citywide, to see how we could really finance it. And eventually it was the state, the Massachusetts Cultural Council money on the state level. The state has a lot of capital money. There was environmental money. If you were building a park, there was money to do that. And I would just go and I'd say, this land, this is where Frederick Douglass used to live. And people would cough up the money. So,
because who wants to see the land that Frederick Douglass is on, occupied by people's trash?
That's right. That's right. And I would say that. I would say, if this was somebody else, you'd be right there cleaning it up. So you better clean it up for me. And, once people understood the importance that the Johnson House is a National Historic Site, it's written up all over the world, but not in New Bedford. Now it is. And of course, we were able to finance the park. We were able to get individuals from Boston. The Cultural Outreach Group is a landscaping group that comes and works with under-resourced communities. And they came, and while we paid them a certain amount of money, it was way below what we would have paid any kind of a landscape artist. And they designed everything. They helped us manage it. The Parks Department, working with Mary Raposa, myself, Ann Lauro, and others, we pulled all that together. And I was able, I'm a grant writer and a fundraiser, I was able to pull a lot of the money together. So collectively, the city, working with the Office of Community Development, the Parks Department, and then working with nonprofit organizations in Boston, we were able to develop all that. The statue is very much the process that we've used with all of our public art. We have 1 or 2 community meetings where we present to whoever comes, and everybody's invited. Usually the meetings are at like the library, or in some cases we did meetings at the Roach Jones Duff House, but people were invited and they knew we were going to present our ideas on a park for the abolition movement. So in some ways, people were learning about the abolition movement first because they didn't know anything from our historic organizations about the abolition movement and who was involved and how important it was to really ending the Civil War at the time. So we were able to do that, but we also spent a lot of time talking about the importance of having some kind of a figure of Frederick Douglass. And it really is because of those meetings, the community members would say, when Douglass lived here, he was only 20. He wasn't this towering figure of a middle-aged man with a beard and wild hair. He was a seaman. So we'd like to see somebody that looked like he worked on the waterfront. And they would say things like, we don't want an older man. We want a young man. We want a young Frederick Douglass. So out of those conversations, we came up with a concept of somebody who had worked on the docks, was young, and was in workman's clothes. He wasn't a well-known figure then. And then what we did was we did again, a national search. We sent out our description to the world and invited people to compete to win a commission from us for the Frederick Douglass statue. So that's how that went.
You mentioned the desire to have young Frederick Douglass, and I had a friend visit from Portland, Oregon, and that was the first thing he noticed. It's just, I'm so used to seeing middle-aged, bearded Frederick Douglass. And yeah, it's because he was a young man here. And, we forget that unless,
That's right.
Folks like you remind us, yeah, he wasn't, the bearded, the gray-haired fellow, who was orating. He was a young person working the docks here. And it gives a totally different perspective of him for people who come here and see that, not realizing that.
And for young people, again, this goes back to my education background. For young people, a young Frederick Douglass learned to be the spokesperson for freedom that he did from his life in New Bedford. So he spoke in the churches here. He was only 20. He was speaking in the churches here. He starts his family here. There are all these things that he does as a young man that he was able to do in New Bedford that he wasn't able to do anywhere else. So we always tell our students that. And when you read Douglass's own autobiography, he talks about how important New Bedford was to the development of his idea on freedom, on democracy. Not that he didn't know them before, of course, because he did run away. That's why he runs away and comes to the North after living in Maryland. But it's that he was able to develop all those things even more once he came to New Bedford, which treated him well. And then he, of course, gets involved in the anti-slavery movement in Nantucket and in Massachusetts.
I want to ask, the Historical Society is coming up on its 30th anniversary, right? Am I right?
Right.
Are there any special plans for year 30 for the Historical Society?
Well, we have a couple of special plans. One is, and Frederick Douglass is an international figure. There's a whole organization called International Frederick Douglass, and they will be coming to the United States at the end of September and the first week of October. Last year, they were in Ireland. This year, they're going to come to New Bedford on October 2nd. So we have this whole, many of the places that Frederick Douglass frequented are still around. It's like his first job was at the First Unitarian Church. The First Unitarian Church is opened and built in 1838, the year that Frederick Douglass is here. So there's walking tours. There'll probably be lectures and things all on October 2nd, but the whole week that International Frederick Douglass Week happens is in Boston. So sometimes they'll be back and forth between New Bedford and Boston. So that's pretty special that we're being recognized on an international level to create and help Frederick Douglass grow at that time. We also will be involved in an art exhibit coming. Anthony Barboza, who is a New Bedford resident who went through the schools in New Bedford and became an international Cape Verdean photographer, will have his first solo show in New Bedford. He's had solo shows all over the world, but in New Bedford, from September 11th all the way to the end of November. And we'll be helping with that. We'll be sponsoring with that. Many of us knew Anthony, have admired his work, and you'll see that. That's another special item for us.
Where will the exhibition be?
So the exhibition will be at the Art Museum. And, the Historical Society, with the Johnson House, we have very small space. So we do a lot of collaborative work with other organizations. And we're happy that we work quite frequently with the Art Museum. So that's where that will be.
Right in the heart of downtown. Perfect.
That's right. Right in the heart of downtown.
So I just want to ask, is there anything we haven't talked about regarding your work or the Historical Society that you would like to hit on right now?
Well, I'd also like to say one of our next projects is going to be to start the research to do a cemetery tour of the abolition sites.
Oh.
So there are quite a number of abolitionists, black and white, who fought for the freedom of African Americans and Native Americans, people of color, here in New Bedford. And there's never been a real site, a walking tour. So we'll be working with some people to do that. But, we know who many of them are. We've been to their grave sites, working with the New Bedford Preservation Society, for instance. We helped really reorganize Daniel Drayton's grave. He was a well-known abolitionist who actually committed suicide in New Bedford after being in jail and arrested for trying to help fleeing enslaved people. So his a beautiful monument in rural, I believe. Yeah, it's in rural. And there are a number of other people. So we want to put that together. And that may be a way to, young people like cemeteries. So that would be a way to get some young people to work with us and learn how to clean grave sites and to create some of the narrative to help people understand how important New Bedford was during the abolition movement.
Lee, thank you so much. If there's anything else you want to add, please feel free. But it's been really great spending this time with you, learning about what you've done. And the one thing I would say is I'm really present to how crucial the Historical Society's public art is to the face of downtown. It's been hugely influential, and I think some of that work has helped spearhead the growth of public art in downtown to the point where, it's not just that you turn a corner, you see something from the Historical Society. You could see any kind of art anywhere in downtown New Bedford, and a lot of it, it seems to have started with the Historical Society.
Well, it's an important point for you to make, but one of the things that the Historical Society does is we end up mentoring other people. So, for example, at the end of August in Bristol, Rhode Island, we've met with there's a Middle Passage group was putting up their first statue to individuals who had been enslaved by the Newport slave trade. So they've invited us to be special guests because we help them also work through not the idea, but how to get the funding, how to do the process. Because people always feel kind of overwhelmed by these processes, but they're not that difficult when you do kind of step by step. We've also helped groups here, the Booker T. Washington mural. We helped those people. So the Pilgrim United Church came to us, and it's always, how did you do your thing? How did you do the 54th? And we just lay it out to them. This is how you do it. This is how you write up a national request for commissions, and all those things. Once you see how to do it, then in your mind, it becomes an easy way to get things done. So we share our knowledge. We don't hold it back because we want to see more art in the city.
And you've always been highly collaborative. And it seems like mentorship has kind of been historically something you've been a part of anyway, even before the Historical Society. So of course you're going to share that knowledge. And I really love that because, those things are intimidating because you have no idea where to start. And the fact that you're giving folks a framework for creating that is showing the kind of influence that you and the Historical Society have just beyond the bounds of New Bedford.
And the other thing is, as people of color focusing on African American history, people say no to us all the time. And they've said no to us for years. And we just say, we're going to do it anyway. We're going to figure out how to do it anyway. Don't tell me, no, you can't have a historic district. Oh, and I have to say, well, why not? You have one. Why not?
Why can't I wear pants?
That's right.
Why can't I be a surgeon? All of this. It starts with somebody saying, well, you can say no, but I'm still going to do it.
Right. Until I get slapped down, I'll do it. And for the Historical Society, we've done murals, we've done statues, we've done parks, we've saved historic buildings, and we're not going to stop. Even though we have all these edicts and executive orders coming out, we're going to keep doing what we do because we want to make sure, as when you mentioned sharing, if you don't share things, if something happens to you, it's gone. Mm-hmm. But if you share it, then you sent it out as little seedlings with other people and it'll grow.
Perfect. Lee, thank you so much.
Thank you, Scott, for reaching out. And you'll have to come to our art exhibit. I will have to. That's right. I will, in the language of my kids, pinky promise. Lee, thank you so much. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to the Fairhaven Artists Podcast Series on the South Coast Artists Index with your host, Scott Bishop. The Fairhaven Artists Podcast Series and the Fairhaven Performing Artists Podcast Series is sponsored in part with a grant from the Fairhaven Cultural Council, a local agency supported by the Massachusetts Cultural Council, a state agency.